Judge mocks Karoline Leavitt in court, only to be shocked by her brilliant legal strategy. Before we dive in, kindly hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. The courtroom of Monterey County was packed to capacity, buzzing with anticipation. This wasn't just any legal battle, it was Karoline Leavitt, the young political rising star standing at the plaintiff's table. People whispered among themselves, some elbowing their neighbors, others sneaking glances at their phones to record the moment. Outside, news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, ready to broadcast any juicy developments to the world. Karoline had faced tough interviews, political attacks, and national scrutiny, but today her opponent wasn't a rival candidate or a hostile reporter. It was the legal system itself. The lawsuit she filed seemed simple: a property dispute. A wealthy real estate developer named Gerald Madsen had encroached on Karoline's family's land in Carmel by the Sea, building part of a luxury condominium where it didn't belong. Karoline had tried handling it the proper way, through letters, phone calls, and formal complaints, but her warnings had been ignored. Now she stood in court, prepared to argue the case herself. The atmosphere was electric as Judge Wallace Bridger finally entered the room. A portly man in his 60s, Judge Bridger had presided over countless cases throughout his long career. But this was something new. He adjusted his glasses, eyeing the young political figure standing at the plaintiff's table. A smirk played on his lips. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, tapping his gavel once, "I understand you have chosen to represent yourself in this matter." Karoline, standing tall and composed despite her youth, simply nodded. Her gaze was steady, her expression calm. "That's correct, Your Honor." A soft wave of chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others grinned, waiting for what they assumed would be a spectacular failure. Even Madsen, seated at the defense table beside his high-powered attorney, let out a small laugh. Judge Bridger leaned forward. "You do understand that legal proceedings aren't the same as political debates, don't you? There are rules, procedures. It's not as simple as giving a speech and winning over a crowd." The laughter grew louder. Reporters scribbled furiously, and one even whispered, "This is going to be gold." But Karoline didn't flinch. She allowed the laughter to play out, patiently waiting for the room to settle. Then, in a voice calm and clear, she said, "I understand the rules, Your Honor, and I understand the law." Judge Bridger raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and where did you study law, Ms. Leavitt?" The quiet chuckles turned into open laughter. But Karoline, as composed as ever, simply reached into her case file and pulled out a neatly bound stack of documents. She placed them carefully on the table, lightly tapping the top page with her fingers. "I've spent the last 6 months studying every property law relevant to this case. I've read the local zoning code, I've reviewed precedents, and I have gathered more than enough evidence to prove that my family's land has been unlawfully encroached upon." Her voice didn't waver. "And now I'm here to present that evidence. If this court is truly about justice, then let's get to it." The laughter died almost instantly. For the first time, the courtroom realized something important. Karoline Leavitt wasn't here for show. She wasn't here to entertain them. She was here to win. Judge Bridger cleared his throat, suddenly feeling the weight of his earlier mockery. "Very well, Ms. Leavitt," he said. "Let's proceed." Karoline took her seat, her expression unreadable. But as the murmurs of the crowd faded and the trial officially began, there was no denying one simple fact. This was no ordinary case, and Karoline Leavitt was no ordinary woman. She simply adjusted the papers in front of her, methodical as ever. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and deliberate. "You're right," Karoline said, her tone measured. "This isn't a debate stage." She stood slowly, resting both hands on the table. "And I'm not here to entertain you, Mr. Parker." The laughter stopped. Karoline picked up a stack of legal documents and began flipping through them. "You want to talk about expertise? Let's talk about facts." She pulled out a large aerial photograph of her family's property before the construction began. "This is our land in 2001. The boundaries are here." She pointed at the clear, legally recorded property lines. Then she picked up another photo. "And this is our land in 2023. See that?" She pointed to the area where Madsen's development had crept past the boundary line. "That's your client's building on our property." Parker shifted slightly, but Karoline wasn't finished. She pulled out a printed email. "This is the cease and desist notice I sent to Madsen's company when construction first started crossing into our land. No response." She flipped to another page. "This is the second notice. No response." She turned to a third. "And here's the third." She looked up, locking eyes with Parker. "See a pattern here?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "Ms. Leavitt, property disputes are rarely this black and white. There are complexities." Karoline raised her hand, cutting him off. "You ignored the law until you got caught." The room fell silent. Even Judge Bridger seemed taken aback. He'd seen plenty of self-represented plaintiffs, but none with Karoline's sharp focuses and unshakable confidence. She wasn't guessing, she wasn't scrambling, she was prepared, precise, and above all, right. Parker forced a laugh, trying to regain control. Your Honor, I think we're getting a little carried away here. This is just an opening argument. While Mrs. Leavitt certainly knows how to capture attention, we are dealing with legal technicalities. Judge Bridger, who at first had treated the case as little more than a curiosity, was no longer so sure. He folded his hands, glancing between Parker and Karoline. For the first time, he felt a twinge of regret for underestimating her victim. Very well, the judge said. Mr. Parker, you'll have your chance to present your defense soon. But for now, I'd like to continue hearing from Ms. Leavitt. Karoline gave a small nod and took her seat, her face unreadable. But as Parker sat back down, shifting uncomfortably, one thing had become painfully clear. The judge had made a mistake by underestimating Karoline Leavitt, and he wasn't the only one. By the time court adjourned for the day, the story had already exploded. News crews camped outside the Monterey County Courthouse, cameras rolling as reporters breathlessly shared updates. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Karoline Leavitt takes on developer, stuns courtroom with bold legal move. Judge underestimated Leavitt and now regrets it. Social media erupted. Clips from inside the courtroom, some taken illegally by eager spectators, circulated online showing Karoline presenting her evidence while the defense struggled to keep up. Legal analysts debated the case on national television. Some were amused, others were impressed. No one expected Karoline Leavitt to walk in and actually know the law. One analyst commented on a primetime news segment, but she clearly did her homework. She's disciplined, thorough, and let's be honest, she handled that courtroom better than some seasoned attorneys. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed as soon as Karoline stepped through the doors. Ms. Leavitt, did you expect to make such a strong impression? One called out. Karoline adjusted her blazer and gave a modest shrug. I just came to tell the truth. Do you really think you can win this case without a lawyer? Another asked. Karoline paused, turning to face the cameras directly. Justice isn't about how expensive your lawyer is, she said. It's about what's right. Then she walked calmly to her car, ignoring the sea of flashing lights behind her. The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed than before. Reporters filled the gallery, eager to see if Karoline's momentum would continue, or if the defense would finally find a way to push back. Madsen's attorney, Gerald Parker, was done playing nice. He straightened his tie and stepped up to the bench. Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to enter a motion, he said smoothly. Given the media frenzy surrounding this case, I believe it's necessary to ensure that we're operating under proper legal procedure. I move that Ms. Leavitt be required to retain legal counsel or withdraw her claim. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Bridger glanced toward Karoline. Ms. Leavitt, do you have a response? Karoline stood, her hands resting lightly on the table. I do, she said calmly. This is a public court. Yes, the public is watching. But the media didn't put Madsen's buildings on my land. The media didn't ignore my cease and desist letters. And the media didn't file this lawsuit. I did. She turned directly to Parker. You want me to get a lawyer because I'm making you nervous? Parker offered a tight-lipped smile. Hardly. I'm simply pointing out that legal processes are complicated. Even experienced attorneys can struggle. Karoline nodded slightly. I'm sure they do. She picked up another document from her file. But the last I checked, the Constitution doesn't say I need a lawyer to defend my own property. Unless, of course, you're suggesting that an ordinary citizen isn't allowed to stand up for herself anymore. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Judge Bridger cleared his throat. Mr. Parker, while I understand your concerns, Ms. Leavitt has every right to represent herself. Parker clenched his jaw. He'd just lost another round. As the morning session continued, Karoline called her first witness, Jacob Reynolds, a retired land surveyor who had worked in Monterey County for over 30 years. He had personally surveyed Karoline's family's property multiple times. Mr. Reynolds, Karoline said, approaching the witness stand, you've reviewed the property records and surveys, correct? Yes, ma'am, Reynolds replied. I've worked with the Leavitt family for decades. Their property lines have never changed. Karoline nodded and held up a document. Can you confirm that this is the original property deed? Reynolds glanced at it and nodded. Yes, this clearly states that the land in question belongs to the Leavitt family. Karoline turned to the jury. There it is, black and white. Parker jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. Ms. Leavitt is not qualified to interpret legal documents before the jury. Judge Bridger hesitated, then sighed. Sustain. Ms. Leavitt, please keep your questions within proper boundaries. Karoline nodded. Understood. Let's keep it simple. She turned back to Reynolds. Has there ever been a legal dispute over our property lines before? No, ma'am, Reynolds said firmly. Karoline looked back to the judge. No further questions. I'd assume that's from our development project, Madsen replied. Karoline nodded, holding the two photos side by side. And can you explain why part of your development is sitting on my family's land? Madsen exhaled through his nose, clearly annoyed. Ms. Leavitt, property disputes happen all the time. Lines get blurred. It's a complicated business. Karoline took a step forward. Blurred? Her voice remained calm, but there was steel behind it. She turned to the jury. Boundaries don't get blurred by accident. They get ignored. Karoline carefully placed the photos down and picked up a document, her official cease and desist letter sent to Madsen's company months before the lawsuit. Did you receive this letter? Madsen hesitated, then sighed. I'm sure our legal team handled it. Karoline kept her gaze steady. That's not what I asked. Did you personally receive this letter? Madsen shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Yes, I suppose I did. Karoline turned back to the jury. And after receiving this letter, after I made it clear you were building on land that wasn't yours, did you stop construction? Madsen's jaw tightened. The silence in the courtroom stretched. Finally, he cleared his throat. No. Another murmur rippled through the courtroom. Karoline didn't react. She didn't press. She let the jury absorb that answer in full. After a long pause, she simply said, no further questions. As Karoline walked back to her seat, she glanced at the jury. The skepticism that had been there on the first day had vanished. Now they were leaning forward, fully engaged, their expressions serious. Judge Bridger rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. He'd underestimated Karoline. So had Madsen's lawyer, so had everyone. And now, piece by piece, she was dismantling the defense's case. Parker stood, visibly irritated. He buttoned his jacket and approached Madsen. Mr. Madsen, he began, his voice smoother than before. To be clear, at the time construction began, was it your understanding that you were within your legal rights? Madsen straightened his tie. Yes. And did you knowingly, deliberately violate property laws? Madsen shook his head. No. Any misunderstanding of the property lines was just that, a misunderstanding. Parker nodded and turned to the judge. Your Honor, my client is a businessman. He operates within the law to the best of his ability. There was never any intent to break the law. Any mistakes made were purely incidental. Karoline leaned back in her chair, watching. She didn't need to say another word. The damage had already been done. Judge Bridger sighed. We'll continue proceedings after a brief recess. He banged the gavel, and the courtroom erupted into chatter. As Karoline stood to stretch, a reporter whispered to a colleague, this isn't just a property case anymore. It's Karoline Leavitt versus corporate greed. Another reporter nodded, and she's winning. Meanwhile, at the defense table, Parker leaned close to Madsen. We need to rethink our strategy, he muttered. If we don't shut her down soon, this case is going to spiral out of control. Madsen scowled, his confidence cracking. Do whatever you have to. Across the courtroom, Karoline sat back down, as calm as ever. She wasn't worried, she wasn't flustered, because she knew one thing. When the truth is on your side, you don't need to fight dirty. You just let the facts speak for themselves. By the time court reconvened, the tension had shifted. The smug confidence Gerald Parker had entered with that morning was starting to fray. Gerald Madsen, the real estate mogul, who had once dismissed Karoline Leavitt as just another ambitious politician playing lawyer, now sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched. Karoline, meanwhile, remained composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as she watched the defense whisper urgently among themselves. Judge Bridger rubbed his temples before turning his attention to Parker. Mr. Parker, you may proceed with your next witness. Parker stood, buttoning his suit jacket, and faced the courtroom. Your Honor, at this time, the defense calls James Whitaker, a senior land assessor, to the stand. A balding man in his early 60s approached the witness stand with a neutral expression as he was sworn in. Parker adjusted his tie and stepped forward. Mr. Whitaker, you've been a land assessor for over 35 years, correct? Yes, sir. And in that time, have you come across cases where property disputes were caused by outdated surveys or inaccurate boundary markers? Of course, Whitaker said, nodding. It happens more often than people think. Even legally recorded boundaries sometimes need minor adjustments after updated surveys. Parker turned toward the jury, subtly gesturing as if guiding them toward his point. So, would you say it's possible that Ms. Leavitt's claim, while understandable, might be based on an outdated understanding of her property's legal boundaries? Whitaker hesitated. I would say it's possible, he admitted. Parker smiled. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. No further question. He stepped back, looking pleased. For the first time, it seemed like he might have scored a point for the defense. But Karoline was already rising from her chair. She approached the witness stand with slow, deliberate steps, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. When she reached the stand, she rested her hands lightly on the rail and locked eyes with Whitaker. "Mr. Whitaker," she said evenly, "how often have you seen developers like Mr. Madsen push past legal property lines?" Whitaker blinked. "Excuse me? You've been a land assessor for 35 years, Karoline continued. "In that time, how often have you seen developers knowingly build over property line, assuming the other party won't fight back?" Whitaker glanced at Madsen, then Parker, before clearing his throat. I can't say for sure." Karoline nodded. "Let me help you out." She placed a document on the witness stand. "This is a record of past property disputes involving Madsen Development Corporation. Would you care to tell the court how many times they've been accused of boundary violations?" Whitaker adjusted his glasses and scanned the page. His face tensed. "There are 5 recorded disputes." Karoline arched an eyebrow. 5. "And how many of those cases were settled out of court?" Whitaker swallowed. "All of them." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Karoline turned to the jury. "So we're not talking about an innocent mistake here. We're talking about a pattern, a man who's been caught before and paid his way out every time." Parker shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. Prior disputes have no bearing on this case." Judge Bridger sighed. "Overruled. But Ms. Leavitt, please keep your questions focused." Karoline nodded. "One more, Mr. Whitaker, have you personally reviewed the official survey of my family's land?" Whitaker hesitated. "Not personally, no." Karoline nodded again and turned to the judge. No further question. As she walked back to her table, Parker looked visibly rattled. Even his own witness had just admitted he hadn't reviewed the key piece of evidence. Parker leaned toward Madsen, who was already whispering angrily. "This is a disaster," Madsen muttered. "I pay you to win, not to let some politician make us look like fools," Madsen hissed. Parker clenched his jaw, speaking low. "Relax. She got in a few good shots, but we're still ahead." Madsen narrowed his eyes. "Are we?" Parker didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, at this time we'd like to enter our closing argument." Judge Bridger exhaled slowly and nodded. "Very well, Mr. Parker. You may begin." Parker straightened his jacket and turned to the jury, launching into his carefully rehearsed monologue. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we've certainly been entertained over the past few days. We've watched Miss Leavitt put on quite the performance. But let's be clear, justice isn't a show. It's not about theatrics or emotion. It's about the law. And the law is not on Ms. Leavitt's side." He gestured to the courtroom. "We live in a world of complexities, property laws, boundary disputes, legal interpretations. These things require expertise. And while Ms. Leavitt has presented a passionate case, passion alone doesn't establish legal ownership." Parker nodded confidently. "My client followed all the necessary procedures before beginning construction. Any claims to the contrary are misunderstandings, not malicious acts. And while we respect Ms. Leavitt's dedication, we urge you to focus on the facts, not the spectacle." With that, he returned to his table. Karoline remained seated for a long moment before rising. She walked toward the jury, her steps slow and deliberate. Then she spoke. "You know," she began, "I've been in a lot of tough rooms over the years." She paused. "But not a single one of them was about letting powerful people get away with what they knew was wrong." She turned toward Madsen. "Mr. Madsen knew exactly what he was doing. He thought I wouldn't fight back. He thought I'd settle quietly, just like all the others. He thought he could steal a piece of my family's land, turn it into luxury condos, and walk away even richer." She let the words hang in the air. "But you're here today because justice isn't about money. It isn't about how expensive your lawyer is or how many custom suits you wear." Karoline looked at the jury, locking eyes with each of them. "It's about doing what's right." She took a small step back. "And that's all I have to say." As she returned to her seat, the weight of her words settled over the room. Judge Bridger nodded solemnly. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow, when the jury will deliver its verdict." And just like that, the battle neared its end. The courtroom was silent. The following morning, the usual buzz had been replaced by tense anticipation. Today, the trial would take its most decisive turn yet. Judge Bridger took his seat and adjusted his glasses, looking more serious than he had since the case began. "Ms. Leavitt, do you have any further witnesses before we move to closing arguments?" Karoline stood, steady as ever. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Mr. Daniel Ali to the stand." The name was unfamiliar to most in the room, but it sent an immediate ripple of unease through the defense table. Gerald Parker frowned, glancing at his client. "Who the hell is Ali, Mads?" Madsen whispered. Parker shook his head. "No idea." Then the courtroom doors swung open. A man in his early 50s walked in, dressed in a work jacket and jeans, his boots scuffing softly against the floor as he made his way to the stand. His face was tanned and lined from years of outdoor labor. After he was sworn in, Karoline approached, her pace as steady as her voice. "Mr. Ali," she began, Could you tell the court what you do for a living? Ali cleared his throat. I'm a construction foreman, been in the business over 20 years. And who have you worked for recently? Ali shifted slightly, glancing at Madsen before exhaling. Madsen Development Corporation. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Parker stood immediately. Your Honor, I object. This witness wasn't disclosed to the defense. Judge Bridger raised an eyebrow at Karoline. Ms. Leavitt? Karoline nodded. Your Honor, Mr. Ali came forward last night of his own accord. He wasn't originally part of my witness list, but after hearing the testimony so far, he realized something. She turned to Ali. Tell the court what you realized. Ali swallowed hard, then looked straight at the judge. I realized I didn't want to be part of a cover-up. Gasps filled the room. Judge Bridger banged his gavel. Order! Parker's face turned pale. Madsen stiffened in his chair, like a man seeing his entire empire crumble. Karoline folded her arms. Mr. Ali, let's be clear. You're saying there was a cover-up? Ali nodded. Yes, ma'am. Karoline walked over to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. These are the original blueprints and construction plans submitted to the city for Madsen's development. Can you confirm this is the correct document? Ali flipped through the pages and nodded. Yes, these are the official plans. Karoline leaned in slightly. And was there ever a second set of plans? Ali hesitated, glancing at Madsen, whose face was now turning bright red. Finally, Ali sighed. Yes, there was a second set of plans. They weren't officially filed, but they included modifications, changes to push the property lines. More murmurs from the crowd. Parker jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. We have no evidence of these so-called second plans. Judge Bridger turned to Ali. Do you have proof of these altered plans? Ali reached into his pocket and pulled out a USB flash drive. Yes, Your Honor. I made a backup of all the project files before construction began. These documents show two different versions of the same project, one legal and one not. Parker looked like he wanted to disappear. Madsen gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Judge Bridger gestured to the bailiff, who collected the flash drive and handed it to the court clerk. Have this examined immediately, Bridger ordered before turning back to Ali. Mr. Ali, are you saying Mr. Madsen was fully aware his project was encroaching on Ms. Leavitt's land? Ali hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he knew. We all knew. We were told to keep quiet. Karoline turned to the jury, letting those words settle. Then she looked back at Ali. Why are you telling the truth now? Ali exhaled, looking down at his hands. Because I watched this trial. I saw you standing there alone, just trying to get justice. And I realized that's the kind of man I should be. A brief silence passed. Karoline gave a small nod. No further questions. Judge Bridger turned to Parker. Mr. Parker, do you wish to cross-examine? Parker looked at Madsen, then back at the judge. He hesitated before sighing. No, Your Honor. Judge Bridger nodded. Very well. This court will take a brief recess before moving forward. He banged his gavel as the courtroom erupted into whispers. At the defense table, Madsen leaned toward Parker, furious. What the hell just happened? You said we had this under control, Madsen hissed. Parker rubbed his face, speaking quietly. That was before your own foreman flipped on us. He exhaled. We're in trouble, Gerald. Across the room, Karoline Leavitt sat back in her chair watching them. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She was simply waiting because she knew what was coming next. And now, for the first time since the trial began, so did Madsen. The tension in the Monterey County courtroom was electric as the judge called for a recess. Spectators filed out, whispering with excitement. Reporters rushed to their phones, typing furiously. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Star witness flips. Leavitt's case takes stunning turn. Madsen's development scheme exposed in court. Karoline Leavitt's lone fight for justice gains ground. Inside the courtroom, Karoline remained seated, unaffected by the media storm. She had spent her career standing her ground under pressure, and today was no different. She sipped her water, occasionally glancing at Gerald Madsen, who was now locked in a furious conversation with his attorney. Madsen's face was red with frustration. Fix this, he hissed. We cannot lose this case. Parker sighed, rubbing his temple. We may not have a choice, Gerald. When court reconvened, the jurors filed back in, their faces serious. The weight of what had just happened was clear. A key witness, Madsen's own foreman, had exposed undeniable evidence of deliberate encroachment, and now, with digital records submitted as proof, the truth was impossible to bury. Judge Wallace Bridger leaned forward, his voice firm. Court is now back in session. Mr. Parker, given the new evidence presented, do you have any motions before we proceed? Parker stood, adjusting his tie, trying to regain control. Your Honor, the defense would like to request a delay to review the files provided by Mr. Ali. Karoline sat back, arms crossed. She had expected that move. Judge Bridger shook his head. Motion denied. The defense had ample opportunity to present a complete and honest record of their property lines. Instead, it took a whistleblower to reveal the truth. His gaze sharpened on Parker. "We are proceeding with closing argument." Parker swallowed hard and walked to the front of the room, his confidence visibly shaken. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, voice smooth but lacking conviction. "You've heard a lot throughout this trial. You've seen documents, heard testimony, and yes, witnessed some unexpected drama." He glanced toward Karoline as if suggesting this had all been her production. "But I remind you, this is not a political rally. It's not about emotion. It's about the law. And the law requires us to focus on facts." Parker continued, his words losing momentum. "Property disputes happen. Records can be outdated. Boundaries shift. Misunderstandings occur. Yes, my client's company may have made mistakes, but mistakes are not crimes. Mr. Ray Madsen is a respected businessman who has contributed significantly to this region. To paint him as some kind of villain oversimplifies the situation." He offered the jury his most practiced smile. "I ask you to see this case for what it is. A disagreement over land, not deliberate wrongdoing." With that, he nodded and returned to his seat. The courtroom was quiet as Karoline stood. She didn't approach the jury like Parker had. She stayed beside her chair, hands casually resting in her pockets. "I don't have a fancy speech," she said simply. "No theatrics, no legal tricks." She looked across the room, meeting the eyes of each juror. "What I have is a piece of land. Land my family worked for. Land we paid for. Land we took care of. And bit by bit, someone thought they could steal it." Her voice was steady and calm, but every word hit like a hammer. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was greed, plain and simple. She turned slightly, glancing at Madsen, whose face had gone pale. "You've seen the evidence, you've heard the truth from someone who was inside Madsen's own company, and you've heard from his lawyer, who wants you to believe this is all just a big mistake." She let the silence settle. "But you know better." Another pause. "That's all I have to say." Karoline returned to her seat. The room was still. Judge Bridger turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you now have the case. Court is adjourned until the jury reaches a verdict." He banged his gavel, and the jurors filed out to deliberate. Outside the courtroom, reporters dashed to broadcast the latest twists. At the defense table, Madsen leaned toward Parker, his anger replaced by something else. Fear. "We should have settled," he muttered. Parker sighed. "Yeah, we should have." Meanwhile, Karoline sat in silence, her expression unreadable. A younger, less experienced person might have paced or fidgeted, but Karoline was patient. She had stood up to the most powerful people in the room, and the truth was already out. Now it was only a matter of time. Hours passed, the tension climbed. Karoline remained composed, hands folded on the table, her eyes on the jury room door, waiting. Meanwhile, across the aisle, Madsen was falling apart. The polished exterior was gone. He checked his watch. He whispered nervously, "Maybe they'll come back with a compromise," he muttered. "A smaller settlement, at least." Parker didn't respond. He just scribbled meaningless notes on his legal pad, lost in the quiet understanding that the case was over. And Karoline? She just waited, because she already knew how this story would end. She hadn't looked at Madsen or Parker. She hadn't even glanced at the jury room. Instead, Karoline Leavitt simply waited. The truth was on her side, and she knew it. It was never a question of if she would win, only when. Then, the door to the jury room opened. A bailiff stepped forward, signaling the courtroom to rise. Everyone stood in silence as the forewoman of the jury, a middle-aged woman with a composed, steady presence, entered the room. In her hands was a large manila envelope. Judge Bridger, watching the jury closely, gave her a nod. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The forewoman nodded, walking to the bench. She handed the envelope to the judge, who opened it carefully, taking a moment to scan the contents before turning back to the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Bridger began, his voice steady, "the jury has returned with a verdict. Please be seated." The room sat in hushed anticipation, the air thick with tension. Judge Bridger looked at the envelope once more before reading aloud. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Karoline Leavitt. We find that the defendant, Gerald Madsen and Madsen Development Corporation, knowingly encroached upon the plaintiff's property and acted in bad faith by ignoring repeated requests to cease construction. The court awards the plaintiff full compensation for damages incurred, as well as additional punitive damages for the defendant's willful disregard of property law." For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Karoline didn't react immediately. She simply sat still, composed, letting the words settle. Then the murmurs began. Reporters scrambled to send out the breaking news. the room filled with whispers of disbelief and awe. At the defense table, Gerald Madsen sat frozen, his face drained of color as the weight of the verdict sank in. He had lost. The case he had once dismissed as a nuisance, the trial he thought he controlled, had become a public disaster. "Your Honor," Madsen's voice quivered before he forced himself to speak clearly, "we request an immediate stay of execution on this verdict. This decision is—" Judge Bridger held up a hand. "The jury's decision is final, Mr. Madsen. Any motions to delay or appeal must go through the appropriate channels." Then he turned his attention to Karoline. "Ms. Leavitt, would you like to make a statement before we conclude today's proceedings?" Karoline stood slowly, her movements composed and deliberate. The room quieted as all eyes turned to her. "I've spent a lot of time standing up to powerful people," Karoline began, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "But this time, it wasn't just about politics. I wasn't giving a speech. I wasn't fighting for headlines. I was fighting for what's right." She glanced toward Madsen. Mr. Madsen took land that wasn't his. He thought he could ignore the law, silence the truth, and get away with it. He thought no one would stop him. She looked back to the jury. "But today, you made sure that justice was served." The room stayed silent, hanging on every word. "This wasn't just about property lines. It was about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. And I want to thank the jury for having the courage to do that." She nodded toward the judge. "No further comments, Your Honor." Judge Bridger nodded in return, his expression softening. "The court acknowledges the verdict. The defendant is hereby ordered to pay all awarded damages in full, including the plaintiff's legal fees. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down sharply, and the room erupted. Reporters surged forward, eager to capture Karoline's words. Madsen's legal team scrambled, stunned by the loss. But Karoline didn't linger. She nodded respectfully to the judge and walked toward the exit. As she passed Madsen's table, she didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The verdict had said it all. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters waited, microphones extended in every direction. Cameras flashed, but Karoline held up her hand, signaling them to pause. She took a deep breath, then spoke clearly into the nearest camera. "Justice was served today. But this isn't just about one person standing up for what's theirs. It's about every person who's had their rights ignored, their property taken, or their voice silenced. Today was a reminder that no matter who you are, we all deserve justice." And with that, Karoline Leavitt stepped away from the cameras, quietly victorious. The legal battle was over, but outside the courthouse, a new challenge was unfolding: public opinion. As Karoline crossed the courthouse steps, reporters peppered her with more questions. "Ms. Leavitt, how does it feel to defeat such a powerful developer? Do you believe this case sets a precedent for property rights? Will you take legal action against other corporations like Madsen's?" Karoline paused on the steps, the afternoon sun casting long shadows behind her. She adjusted her blazer and waited for the noise to settle. "Justice was served today," she said, her voice firm and calm, cutting through the chaos. "And it wasn't because of who I am. It wasn't because the cameras were watching. It was because the truth was on my side. And when the truth is on your side, you don't need to play dirty. You just have to stand your ground." The reporters scribbled notes furiously, but Karoline was already moving. She hadn't come for the spectacle. She had come for justice, and she had found it. As she made her way toward her car, she spotted Daniel Ali, the construction foreman whose testimony had changed the entire trial. He stood off to the side, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, looking uncertain. Karoline approached him. "You did the right thing," she said. Ali exhaled, clearly relieved. "I wasn't sure I had it in me," he admitted. "I've worked in this business a long time, seen a lot of things get buried, but watching you stand up there, not backing down, I realized I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Karoline gave him a small nod of respect. "It takes courage to do what you did." Ali hesitated, then smiled faintly. "If you ever need someone on your team, I'd be proud to work for someone who doesn't cut corner." Karoline smiled back. "I'll keep that in mind." And with that, she walked away. Her fight won, her integrity intact, and justice finally served. "I'll keep that in mind," Karoline said with a nod. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Gerald Madsen was fuming. He sat slumped at the defense table, his face pale, fists clenched tightly. Parker, his lawyer, was quietly packing up his files, knowing there was nothing left to fight for. "This isn't over," Madsen muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Parker sighed. "It is, Gerald." He snapped his briefcase shut. "You gambled. You lost." Madsen shot him a sharp glare. "We appeal." Parker shook his head. "You can file whatever appeals you want, but we both know this case was never just about legal technicalities. The jury saw straight through you. The media's already made you the villain. You're finished." Madsen clenched his jaw, but deep down he knew Parker was right. His reputation was shattered. His company's stock had started to plummet the moment the verdict hit the news. Investors were pulling out, and the city had already hinted at reviewing his other projects for violations. For the first time in his career, Gerald Madsen had been held accountable, and he had no idea what to do about it. Days later, Karoline Leavitt was back in Carmel by the sea, standing quietly on the land she had fought so hard to protect. The construction equipment was gone. The workers, the noise, the destruction, cleared away by court order. Her land was hers again, untouched, just as it should have been. She took a deep breath, feeling the crisp, salty ocean breeze on her face. This wasn't just her victory, it was a statement, a declaration that no matter how powerful or wealthy someone was, they had no right to take what wasn't theirs. As she walked the edge of her property, inspecting the borders that had been ignored for so long, she noticed a familiar figure standing by the fence. Judge Wallace Bridger, hands in his pockets, looking out over the land. Karoline approached him. "Didn't expect to see you out here," she said. Bridger chuckled. "Figured I owed you a proper handshake, Ms. Leavitt. I misjudged you at the start of that trial." Karoline studied him for a moment. "You weren't the only one." Bridger extended his hand. "Well, consider this my official apology. You proved me wrong." Karoline shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that." Bridger glanced out at the rolling hills and the sparkling water beyond. "So what's next for you? Going to build something here?" Karoline looked across the land, peaceful and still. She shook her head. "No, I'm just going to keep it the way it is." The judge nodded. "Good call." He hesitated before adding, "Not everyone would have fought the way you did. Most people would have taken a settlement and moved on." Karoline smirked. "Most people aren't me." Bridger chuckled. "That's for damn sure." With that, the judge turned and headed back to his car, leaving Karoline alone on her land. Hands in her pockets, she stood quietly, looking out over the property she had saved. The fight was over, the dust had settled, and once again, she had proven that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand their ground. The world would keep spinning, developers like Madsen would rise and fall, but as long as there were people brave enough to fight for what's right, justice would always have a fighting chance. And Karoline Leavitt had just reminded everyone of that. With one last glance over her land, she turned toward her home, leaving the rest of the world to talk about the example she'd just set.